$859 billion. That's how much U.S. Treasury debt China just put on the chopping block. Not sold yet. Not dumped in panic. Put into position. The largest single repositioning of dollar assets by a foreign power in modern history. And if Beijing pushes the button, the financial architecture that's held since 1944 doesn't just crack, it shatters. And here's what that means for you. Every retirement account, every mortgage rate, every price at every store, all of it floats on a system where the world needs dollars and America controls the supply. The second that need disappears, the value proposition collapses. Your purchasing power doesn't decline gradually. It drops like a stone. Gas that costs $4 today could hit $7 within months. Not because of supply shocks, because of currency shock. A treasury fire sale triggered by Beijing would flood global markets with dollars nobody wants, devaluing everything denominated in them, which includes your paycheck, your savings, and your future. This channel operates on zero corporate funding, zero government backing, and zero pressure to soften what the numbers actually say. If analysis that follows the math instead of the narrative matters to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's about to unfold won't be covered honestly anywhere else. Let me show you what happened. Over the past 18 months, China has been quietly reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. Not dramatically, not in a way that sets off immediate alarms, but consistently, methodically, from a peak of $3 trillion down to $775 billion as of the latest reporting. That's a $525 billion reduction. But here's the part that changes everything. Intelligence analysts tracking capital flows now estimate China has repositioned another $859 billion in dollar-denominated assets held through offshore entities, Belgian clearinghouses, and Caribbean financial centers into liquidation-ready tranches. These aren't investments anymore. They're ammunition. The official story from Washington is that this is routine portfolio rebalancing. The Treasury Department's line is that foreign holders adjust positions all the time based on domestic needs and yield curves. Nothing to see here. Standard monetary policy. That's the story they want you to believe. But the operational reality tells a different story entirely. China isn't rebalancing. China is building a weapon, and the target is dollar hegemony itself. Here's why the official narrative is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Routine rebalancing doesn't involve moving assets into structures specifically designed for rapid liquidation. It doesn't involve coordinating with other BRICS nations to establish alternative settlement systems. It doesn't involve stockpiling physical gold at rates not seen since the 1970s. China has added over 400 tons of gold to its official reserves in the past 2 years. That's not portfolio optimization. That's preparation for a currency regime that doesn't orbit around the Federal Reserve. Now let me show you the technical architecture of what China has constructed. The dollar's global dominance rests on one simple mechanism. Oil gets priced in dollars, which means every country needs dollars to buy energy, which means every country holds treasury bonds to store those dollars, which means America can print money to pay its debts and the world absorbs the inflation. It's the most elegant extortion system ever designed, but it only works if everyone plays along. The second a major economy says no, the second they create a path to buy oil in yuan or gold or anything except dollars, the whole pyramid wobbles. China hasn't just been selling treasuries. They've been constructing the alternative. The Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange now settles contracts in yuan. The Belt and Road Initiative requires participants to use yuan for infrastructure financing. The digital yuan allows cross-border settlement without touching the SWIFT system. And here's the kicker. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system since 1974, has started accepting yuan for oil sales. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to prove the concept works. Enough to show the world there's a door out of the dollar trap. Let me show you what the Pentagon is not telling you and why their silence is deafening. In classified briefings obtained by defense analysts, Pentagon economic warfare units have wargamed a Chinese treasury dump scenario 3 times in the past 14 months. The conclusions are not public, but people familiar with the simulations report the same outcome in every iteration. A coordinated sale of $800 billion in treasuries over a 2-week period would spike yields above 8%, crash equity markets by 30 to 40%, and force the Federal Reserve into a choice between hyperinflation or a deflationary spiral. There is no third option in the models. Both roads lead to the end of dollar dominance, as we've known it. And here's the dimension almost nobody is discussing. China doesn't have to actually sell. The threat is the weapon. Just the credible possibility that Beijing could dump changes the calculus for every treasury auction, every Federal Reserve decision, every geopolitical negotiation. The United States has operated for 70 years on the assumption that it holds the financial nuclear codes. What happens when another power demonstrates they can trigger mutual assured destruction? You get restraint on both sides, or you get catastrophe, and we're about to find out which. Now here's where it gets even more dangerous. Pull back from the immediate financial mechanics and look at what this fits into. This is not a standalone move. This is one component of a multi-decade strategy to dismantle American primacy and replace it with a multipolar order where Beijing sets terms in its hemisphere and Washington's writ stops at the Pacific. Every piece has been moving into position for years. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS expansion, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the digital yuan, the gold accumulation, the strategic commodity stockpiling. This isn't improvisation. It's a plan. Let me show you the math that explains this entire situation better than any political speech or diplomatic statement ever could. The United States currently carries $34 trillion in national debt. Debt service alone costs over $1 trillion per year at current rates. If yields spike to 8% because foreign buyers disappear, that debt service cost climbs to $2, $7 trillion annually. The entire federal budget is $6, $1 trillion, which means debt service would consume 44% of all federal revenue, not discretionary spending, all revenue. There's no scenario where that's sustainable. Social Security gets cut, Medicare gets gutted, defense spending collapses, or taxes double. Pick your poison. But here's the comparison that makes it visceral. China's total debt to GDP ratio is approximately 280%. Sounds high. Sounds unstable. Except almost all of that debt is denominated in yuan and held domestically, which means China controls both sides of the ledger. They owe money to themselves in currency they print. The United States owes $7, $6 trillion to foreign creditors in currency those creditors could choose to stop accepting. One system has an escape valve. The other has a noose, and Beijing is holding the rope. Now add the production asymmetry. The United States consumes $3, $8 trillion in imported goods annually. It produces $2, $5 trillion in exports. That $1, $3 trillion trade deficit gets financed by foreigners buying treasuries. It's a closed loop. Foreigners sell us goods. We give them dollars. They use those dollars to buy bonds. We use the bond money to buy more goods. The cycle continues forever. Unless foreigners stop buying bonds, then the loop breaks. The dollar crashes. Imports become unaffordable. Inflation doesn't hit 8%. It hits 20%, and there's no historical precedent for a reserve currency surviving that kind of shock. The replacement rate tells the final part of the story. The Federal Reserve needs to sell approximately $2 trillion in new Treasury debt every year just to roll over maturing bonds and finance the deficit. Foreign buyers have historically absorbed 30% of that issuance. If China dumps and other nations follow, that 30% disappears. The Fed has two options. Find domestic buyers, which means Americans cannibalizing their own savings and investment to fund government spending. Or the Fed buys the bonds itself, which is just printing money with extra steps. Printing $600 billion per year on top of existing monetary expansion doesn't lead to soft inflation. It leads to currency crisis. Read those numbers again slowly. $34 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in current debt service, $2, $7 trillion if rates spike, $6 trillion owed to foreigners, $1, $3 trillion trade deficit, $600 billion in foreign treasury purchases that could evaporate. The math is brutal, and it doesn't care about American exceptionalism or historical precedent or the fact that this has never happened before. Math is math, and this math says the system is fragile. Now let me show you the geopolitical chessboard and why every major power is watching this moment with extreme attention. Russia has already made its move. Moscow has reduced its treasury holdings to effectively zero, sold almost everything starting in 2018, shifted into gold, yuan, and euros. They've been coordinating with Beijing on alternative payment systems since before the Ukraine conflict escalated. The SPFS system Russia developed as a SWIFT alternative now connects to China's CIPS system. That's not a coincidence. That's infrastructure for a post-dollar world, and they've been building it for 6 years. China's defense ministry isn't just watching financial markets. They're calculating how this constrains American military options in the Western Pacific. Every dollar spent on debt service is a dollar not spent on naval expansion. Every percentage point of inflation is political pressure on Washington to avoid costly foreign interventions. Beijing strategists understand that you don't need to defeat the U.S. military in direct conflict if you can bankrupt the government funding it. Financial warfare achieves the same goal as kinetic warfare. It just takes longer and leaves the infrastructure intact for when you move in afterward. And here's what makes this truly dangerous. The global south is drawing conclusions. Brazil, India, South Africa, Indonesia, and dozens of smaller nations have watched the United States weaponize the dollar through sanctions on Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and others. They've seen how swift access can be revoked, how dollar-based trade can be choked off, how financial infrastructure can become a tool of coercion, and they're asking themselves a very reasonable question. Why remain dependent on a system that can be turned against us the second we disagree with Washington? China's offering them an answer, an alternative, and it doesn't require tanks or regime change. It just requires accepting yuan instead of dollars. The message transmitting to governments across the developing world is not subtle. American financial dominance has an expiration date. The infrastructure of that dominance is being actively dismantled by the second largest economy on the planet, and there's a choice to make. Stick with the declining hegemon and face the consequences when the system cracks. Or hedge your bets, diversify your reserves, and build relationships with the power that's rising. Most of them are choosing the hedge. That's not anti-American sentiment. That's survival instinct, and it's accelerating. But the piece of this that should terrify anyone paying attention is the dollar's role in global debt markets. Emerging economies owe approximately $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt. If the dollar spikes in value because of a treasury crisis and capital flight, that debt becomes impossible to service. Not harder. Impossible. Countries default. Governments collapse. The IMF steps in with austerity demands that trigger political chaos, and China shows up with yuan-denominated loans at better rates with no political conditions attached. Debt-trap diplomacy becomes the norm, and the United States loses influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the span of 24 months. This isn't theoretical. This is the playbook Beijing has already written. Here's the angle almost nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone in capitals from Moscow to Riyadh to New Delhi understands. The unipolar moment is over. American primacy, as we've known it since 1991, is ending. Not because of military defeat, not because of cultural decline, because the financial foundation is crumbling, and the only thing propping it up is inertia and the lack of a credible alternative. China's building that alternative in real time, with every yuan-denominated oil contract, with every bilateral currency swap agreement, with every BRICS expansion meeting. The architecture of a multipolar financial system is being constructed, and when it's ready, when enough nations have onboarded, when the critical mass is achieved, the switch gets flipped, and the dollar doesn't die. It just becomes one currency among several, which for a country that's been printing money backed by nothing but global demand for decades means the party's over. The European Union is watching with morbid fascination. The euro was supposed to be the alternative reserve currency. It never achieved that status because the political union remained fractured. But a dollar crisis changes that calculus immediately. If Washington can't be trusted to maintain stability, if treasury bonds become risky assets instead of safe havens, European capitals start asking why they're holding dollars at all. The euro gets a second life, not as the global reserve, but as a major pole in a multipolar currency world. And that fractures American influence in NATO, in trade negotiations, in diplomatic pressure. The transatlantic alliance doesn't collapse overnight. It just becomes transactional. Europe hedges. America loses leverage. And the world keeps spinning without waiting for Washington's permission. So here are my 3 predictions with a clock attached. First, within 18 months, we will see a major emerging economy announce it will price its commodity exports exclusively in yuan or a non-dollar currency. Not China making the announcement, a third party, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, or Indonesia. That's the signal that dollar dominance is no longer inevitable. Second, within 36 months, the Federal Reserve will be forced to implement yield curve control to prevent Treasury rates from spiking above 6%, which is just money printing with a different label and marks the beginning of the end for dollar credibility. Third, within 60 months, we will see the emergence of a BRICS-backed digital currency used for cross-border settlement among member nations, and global dollar usage will have declined below 50% of foreign exchange reserves for the first time since World War II. What burned into the international financial system over the past 18 months isn't just a portfolio adjustment. It's a systematic dismantling of the assumption that American debt is risk-free and the dollar is eternal. And once that assumption cracks, once enough players start acting like the emperor has no clothes, the whole system reprices. Not in years, in weeks. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first? A major commodity exporter abandons the dollar, the Fed implements yield curve control, or a BRICS digital currency launches? Tell me, because I read every single one, and the range of perspective shows me where the smart money is actually positioning. If this gave you a framework for understanding what's actually at stake, something the financial media won't explain because their advertisers don't want you connecting these dots, share this with one person who needs to understand that the global financial order they assume is permanent is actually hanging by a thread. The next video goes into the one thing that could actually stop this. The card Washington still holds that China fears. But most people don't even know it exists. Subscribe so you're there when it drops.